I have never met you until this afternoon, and had I met you, I would surely have asked this question. How much of Revolution Number 9 from the White Album was accidental?
Well, it's like an action painting. Revolution Number 9 is the weird one, right? Mm-hmm. I had a lot of loops, tape loops, which is just a circle of tape. If people don't understand it, it repeats itself over and over. Had about 10 of them on different mono machines, all spinning at once with pencils and things holding them. I had a basic track, which was the end of the Revolution song, where we'd gone on and on and on and on. And I just played it sort of live into another tape and just brought them in on faders like you do as a DJ, and brought them in like that. And it was accidental in that way. I think I did it twice maybe, and the second one was the take. Mm-hmm. And the number nine was an engineer's voice. You know, they have test tapes to see that the tapes are all right. Mm-hmm. And the voice was saying, this is number 9 megacycles. So he was talking like that. And I just liked the way he said number 9. So I just made a loop of him saying number 9 and brought that in whenever I felt like it. Uh-huh. And 9th of October, I'll be 105, and 9 seems to be my number. And it's the highest number in the universe. After that, you go back to 1.
It was an extension of Tomorrow Never Knows. It was exactly the same technique, except that instead of using electronic loops, we were using real sound of people, or that silly, stupid voice coming in and number 9, all the time, and burning buildings. And I always saw things rather than heard them, and so you could sit in front of those two speakers and actually see things happening if you shut your eyes. And that was what we were trying to do. I loved that. I thought it was terrific. It wasn't music, but it was a sound picture.
Glass Onion. John Lennon.
Everybody, welcome to bonus episode 14 of Glass Onion on John Lennon, and this is Revolution 9 Revisited. This is something of a bridge episode between the first era of Glass Onion, which culminated in the 100th episodes, A and B, and the new era, because as of now, in mid-June, I don't have any new material recorded, though I've certainly got plans, but the bulk of this episode was recorded and put out a few months ago. I will explain all that in a little while. But there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about first. Of course, the new cleaned up Let It Be film came out in early May, and by now every man and woman and his dog, or her dog, so I just lapsed into Alan Partridge there for a second, I can't help it sometimes. Everyone has expressed and posted opinions and made podcasts and videos about it. I haven't listened to or watched too much of that, mostly just because of the Beatles fatigue I'm feeling a lot of the time. So the brief comments I wanted to make may well have already been made by others, but there you go. There's only so many views you can express, I suppose. I've always liked the film, partly because it contrasts so vividly with A Hard Day's Night, and they do act as nice bookends to the career. I think the gloom that's supposed to pervade the film comes from two things. One is that John Lennon said it, and then others too, such as George Martin in the Complete Beatles documentary, and it became accepted fact that the sessions were awful, they were playing terribly. And yes, there's a little bit of that if you listen to the Nagra tapes. But I think we've discussed already, they were knackered from the White Album. And also, they were playing early in the morning. And there were, little bits of politics going on for sure. And George was having trouble in his personal life, etc., etc. We've already covered that. The other thing, of course, is that the poor quality and the darkness, the literal darkness of the bootleg copy and the graininess added to this, and that latter point has been borne out by the fact that in this new version there's really no darkness at all, meaning figuratively in terms of the Beatles looking gloomy. Just on the cleanup, there's one thing I did want someone to explain to me. So they mentioned one of the things I listened to, that they didn't have the technology to clean this up until recently, and they'd used this MAL, this MAL technology. But if you go back to the mid-90s when the anthology came out, I think right at the beginning of the anthology, they show them playing, is it Bésame Mucho from the Let It Be film, and some other bits from the Let It Be film, and it's absolutely crystal clear. I can't remember about the audio, but certainly the video quality is as good as this one, or possibly even better. So if someone could explain to me how that works, that it seems in the mid-90s they did have good quality footage of it. Anyway, in the film there's an argument between Paul and George, I'll play whatever you want me to play. We all know that one, which always seemed a bit run-of-the-mill really, it would be if they weren't in such a famous band. And of course there's an alternative universe where this argument isn't even captured on audio or video. If they weren't recording everything, or on that day if they just decided, we'd like a couple of hours without you recording, which is in fact what they did the first day that George came back. And the argument may have been forgotten pretty quickly anyway. I suppose it could be seen as a culmination of simmering rage or annoyance on George's part. And I like George's line when they have the argument, "You're not annoying me anymore." And in fact, I think it's in Mark Lewison's Beatles recording sessions book, which goes back to the 80s. There's a quote from, I think it's Norman Smith, saying George had been hating Paul's guts for ages. And that's in the Rubber Soul period. And it brings to mind something that's always fascinated me. So you always get these eyewitness testimonies, be it George Martin or Hunter Davis when he was writing his book. And Hunter Davis's book was so good in that you got little snatches of conversation, and you got a fairly fully fleshed out picture of the night when John Lennon took acid by mistake and Pink Floyd came in to visit. That was one bit I liked about that. What I've always wondered is, if you take the song Think For Yourself on Rubber Soul, Paul did a conventional bass line, and then instead of George playing lead guitar on his own song, Paul recorded a fuzz bass, which is quite similar to the normal bass line, but there are a few differences. And it substitutes the lead guitar. But how did that conversation go? Did Paul just come up to him and go, "Oh, George, I've had a great idea. I'm going to substitute your guitar line"? Now, I suppose if you look at it one way, George was playing lead guitar on Paul's songs, but Paul's a bass player and George is a lead guitarist. So I'm curious how that worked. And there are other things. Another Girl, of course. And it's great lead guitar. It's good stuff, definitely. The Taxman solo, brilliant. But I'm just, of all the things that I would like to know, it's those kind of things. There must have been eyewitnesses other than the Beatles to that moment. Or maybe they weren't. Maybe it was done in private. But all the accounts we always get, they're all quite general. Oh, they were getting on well, they weren't getting on well. Occasionally we get accounts of particular times. Anyway, there's another bit in the Let It Be film where Paul tells John to get on the mic, and Paul kind of wipes his brow, looking a bit tired of the whole thing, and John says, "Don't be bitchy." I'm not sure whether John's line actually followed Paul's in reality, or whether they did what Peter Jackson later did with Get Back, which was almost like fly-in lines from one thing onto another thing. They do this bit in Let It Be where Paul says, "Play the corny one," and then they play Maxwell Silverhammer, but I take that as Michael Lindsay Hogg and Peter Jackson taking artistic license, because they are filmmakers, let's say. Obviously, Peter Jackson is known as a filmmaker as opposed to a documentarian. With Lord of the Rings, he did make They Shall Never Grow Old as well, of course. Other than that, there's really no gloom at all in the film. Now, the other thing is that now Get Back is solidified as the relatively definitive record of January 69, and it's quite conventionally made, I suppose, with a narrative and so forth. Let It Be now works as its shorter and more arty and frankly random cousin, if that's the right word, little sister, I don't know, something like that. The fact they don't explain the switch from Twickenham to Apple and don't cover George's departure, it doesn't really matter when you've got Get Back now fairly solidified, this exhaustive, very exhaustive 8-hour plus version. Plus you've got the Nagra tapes online if you want to delve into that. So I think January 69 has been very well served now. I would urge you to keep listening to Winter of Discontent podcast, however. So the story hasn't quite ended. Of course, Let It Be has as well the videos, quote unquote, of the January 31st songs. Two of Us, Let It Be, and Long and Winding Road, which Get Back is lacking. And I like the new video of Let It Be that they put out. That was a nice addition. One thing I didn't like was the fact that they took out the original coda of the Let It Be film. They included a version of Oh Darling over the credits, which is absolutely fine. But originally, John did his famous quote.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves. I hope we pass the audition.
And then we had some nice ad-libs from Paul, sort of dog barking on Get Back. And now they've just taken away the Get Back ad-libs, which to me is kind of similar to Giles Martin and Sam Ockel, if that's how you say his name, changing the ending of I Am the Walrus on the Blue Album. I mean, on one level, I couldn't care less. You know, there's more important things to worry about in the world than this, but it is quite irritating. Why do you think you got the right to do that? Or was it signed off? This is the thing we don't know. Was it signed off? But I can't see any reason why Paul McCartney would want to get rid of those Get Back ad-libs or change the ending of Walrus. I mean, that just seems incredibly stupid. You love the Beatles. They worked fucking hard to get I Am the Walrus as perfect as possible. Yeah, you can clean up bits if you want to, make the bass and drums more prominent, absolutely. But changing it is almost like changing history in a funny way. On the subject of Giles Martin, I would recommend also a recent episode of Something About the Beatles where they took Giles and Sam to task for some of their mixing on the Sgt. Pepper 50th anniversary onwards, so including White Album, Abbey Road, Revolver and the Red and Blue albums. And Robert had Jerry Hammock and John Leckie. I really loved their critique because it was respectful but irreverent, and the phrase that popped into my mind, I don't think it's the phrase they use, but like Giles Martin himself, the mixes are just a bit too polite, and they did rip on his mix of I Am the Walrus, not just for the changing that ending, but almost ripping the guts out of it, taking the edge off it. And it's nice to hear Beatles commentators doing that, because as usual, you'll get the real normie podcasts who just want everything to be great, and because he's Giles Martin, because he's George Martin's son, because he's one of us, they'll just automatically say, oh, Giles, well done, you did such a great job. And, if you go to a listening party and someone plays any Beatles album in any mix on massive speakers, it's going to sound amazing. And, there have been people who are critical. Once again, I'm not here to get on people's cases, but it's just nice to hear a bit of honesty. That's all I ask for. And that Giles Martin isn't a sacred cow just because he's George Martin's son. Moving on, back in 2000, I remember purchasing a Mojo John Lennon special edition. Now, Mojo and Uncut and Q and those kind of magazines, they often do these great specials where they take the whole magazine and they'll focus on usually, John Lennon or Beatles or Led Zeppelin or Rolling Stones or David Bowie, Pink Floyd, those kind of acts, which, for me is just, I used to lap all that stuff up. Now, former guest of Glass Onion, friend of the show and friend to Mick Ord, who's been supplying me with a lot of material recently because he's been having a clear out. He sent me his copy of this because I mislaid mine. I've got a load of my old stuff and I've always kept most of my John Lennon stuff, but weirdly enough, this is a bit of a strange coincidence. I've been thinking about that and I looked on eBay to try and buy it, and then literally a couple of days later I got a message from Mick. Anyway, he sent me that, and it was a very enjoyable reread. I didn't reread all of it, but I dipped into it. And one of the sections on it is Barry Miles, who was one of those characters, a bit like Allen Ginsberg, who just seemed to be everywhere in the 60s. Every major event, Barry Miles would be there. He's commonly known as just Miles. And of course, to Beatles fans, perhaps most famously, he collaborated with Paul on his sort of memoir many years from now in the 90s. Anyway, I remembered that in this Mojo special edition, there was a section where Barry Miles was defending Albert Goldman. Now, of course, regular listeners will know that not recently, but in the past, we did a lot of Coleman-Goldman stuff. Caitlin Hare was on the show, she was a little girl in the Dakota. Very popular episodes, got lots of good feedback with those. She knew Albert Goldman and she was quite shocked by how he came across in some of the interviews he did promoting his book. And I'll put the TV show that was done that's sometimes called Liverpool versus Albert Goldman. And Albert doesn't come across well, but she said, and Barry Miles, as you'll hear in a minute, says, Albert was hilarious. He was a very funny person. She described him as a bitchy queen. He apparently had a girlfriend, but Caitlin said that she's pretty sure he was closeted. But I mean, that's by the by. The main thing is that he was quite bitchy and quite cutting, but wasn't John Lennon quite bitchy and cutting as well? And I'm going to read a few bits from here that are very interesting, and I'll comment on them. I'd like to read the whole article, but it's fairly long, and I do want to get to the main thrust of this episode. Right, so this is Barry Miles presenting the case for Goldman's defence. Albert Goldman on John Lennon's songs. Quote, I Am the Walrus to me was probably his greatest achievement. It's a song I feel that's great on many levels. It's very powerful. It's radioactive with rage, thundering with rhythm, the voice hard as nails, imagination and emotion all fused at the highest pitch. I think it represents his most characteristic style of utterance, which is angry, surrealistic and very fierce, like satire. At his best, John is like a punk Beethoven. He's bellicose, he's tough, he's virile, he's threatening. John is a brutalist, but he has his nursery side too. In Julia and Dear Prudence, he's infantile. And of course I'd add in My Mummy's Dead as well. So, I mean, first off the bat, that's great writing. I think most people would begrudgingly say, if they read The Lives of John Lennon, which was of course his book that came out in 1988, that he is a very good writer. It's just the tone and some of the cherry-picked facts and to some people lies that are in the book. Carrying on, Iconoclast. So this is Barry Miles now. Iconoclast. I don't think so. I knew John, not well, but a few dinners, a lot of hanging out in recording studios and clubs back in the 60s. And I believe Goldman's biography got closer to the real Lennon than any of the hagiographies, providing you read it with a critical eye. In different circumstances, John Lennon would have got on well with Albert Goldman. He would have appreciated his cutting humour, his profound disregard for the niceties of convention, and his deep love of consciousness-expanding drugs. Albert was the funniest man I've ever met. I had a dinner guest fall off his seat laughing at one of Albert's stories about Lord Buckley, and once had to leave the room myself to catch my breath when he was in full flight about the sexual proclivities of the High Command of the Third Reich. He was an old-fashioned hipster, more from the Beat generation than the 60s rock scene. He was also, although he denied it, an iconoclast, inexorably drawn to society's most sacred cows. So there Barry's saying something that I said, which is that Goldman and Lennon had similarities. In different circumstances, at his death, Albert would have been honoured as the first critic to apply the in-depth research techniques of literary biography to rock writing, something he was uniquely qualified to do, having been a professor of English literature at Columbia University for 20 years and the music critic for Life magazine. But even though it was naturally Albert to whom CBS TV would turn for comment when John Lennon was murdered, circumstances changed. At his death, he was vilified as the man who committed cultural genocide, who attacked the very foundations of popular culture, who dared suggest that John Lennon and Elvis Presley were mere mortals, and that pop culture itself, far from being the music of the streets owned by us all, was in fact owned and copyrighted by some of the toughest corporations since the robber barons. And I think I mentioned before, probably on another podcast, maybe Life and Life Only, that Robert Greene did a book with 50 Cent, and 50 Cent grew up on the streets and was shot, and one of his family members was shot in the street as well. And he said in the music business, they were way tougher. The difference being, of course, they didn't kill people. But in terms of maybe sociopathy and disregard for other people's feelings, some of the music executives were way more ruthless than the people on the street. Just going forward a bit, so Albert Goldman wrote a book about Lenny Bruce that I think was fairly well received. He also wrote a book called Grassroots Marijuana in America Today. But really, of course, it all came crashing down for Albert with a lot of fans with his book about Elvis, which I must confess I haven't read. I've read a few bits of it. I would like to read it one day. That was in the early 80s. So that was a few years after Elvis's death. And in many people's eyes, he took the same MO, which was to start writing a book a few years after someone had died, namely John Lennon, and then that book came out. Now, of course, ask the average Beatles fan who hates that book, if they've read it, and they'll almost certainly say, no, I don't want to read that. A common theme, which is that people are so disgusted by the idea of something that they don't bother absorbing it, be it a book or a film, whatever, so they don't have to have their opinion challenged. Unfortunately, I have to say, making a broader point, I'm a great observer of people and their behaviour. I'm a psychology graduate. I worked with activists for a few years. We spent a lot of time interviewing members of the public, doing documentary screenings of what might be considered provocative material, non-mainstream material about, events that have happened in the world, alternative history, let's call it. So I have a fairly good handle on how people think. And if you ask most people their opinions, they'll give you sometimes quite strong opinions. And then if you ask them the evidence for that, they won't have almost nothing. Mostly just stuff they've been fed. Sorry to say, it's not going to make me any friends saying that, but that's based on a lot of observation and experience. Yeah, Goldman's book is pretty negative. I'm not even a big supporter of it particularly. And some of the stuff he said in the interviews he did, he said John Lennon wasn't generous and he said John Lennon wasn't loving. I didn't know John Lennon, obviously, but I could say there's plenty of evidence against that. Albert doesn't come across well, and he makes a very sweeping statements. But remember, the book was written in 1988, and a lot of people will take books written around that time by other authors, and they'll say, well, the research has moved on, and that's true with Goldman's book. It's true that it has a very, very bitchy tone, but in terms of actually absorbing it, as I said, I'm going to make a fairly solid claim that most of the people have either not read it or only read bits of it and were too disgusted to read on, because John Lennon was and is a sacred cow, just like Elvis. I've just noticed, actually, something that is a bit disconcerting. They've got a picture of Albert Grossman with Janis Joplin, and it's captioned as Albert Goldman. They do look quite similar, actually. They're wearing very similar round glasses, but I'm sure that's Albert Grossman, because he was Janis Joplin's manager. The other claim about the book, which Barry Miles puts here, he'd done over 600 interviews and was the first to sift fact from fiction. Now, I'd say in some cases that second part was correct, but I'm not sure about these 600 interviews, because who are these 600 people? Not too many of them have come forward. But anyway, continuing with Barry Miles, Albert was horrified by the attacks on his book. He had not for a moment realised how controversial he was being. Quote, no writer who has spent years labouring over a book in the attempt to refocus a whole era in popular culture wants to see his work blown away in a stinking cloud of public rancour. Violent controversy renders rational discussion impossible. Again, I agree with that last bit. I'm surprised that he said that he wasn't expecting a backlash. Surely after the Elvis book, it would be pretty naive. He must have known when he finished his book that it wasn't a very positive portrayal of John Lennon, rightly or wrongly. The other thing he said is that something about controversy doesn't sell books, or he would have sold more if he'd done a nice biography. And again, I'm not sure about that. Yes, it's true that if you write a nasty biography and people are aware of that before it comes out, then lots of people will not buy it, but there'll be a lot of people who would buy it. I mean, I was only 13 in 1988. I bought it, but really just as part of my Beatles education. And as I've said before, I bought it a few months after reading the Coleman book, and it was quite amazing. And when Erin Torkelson-Weber was on a few years ago, she said the same thing. She read them both within a few months and just couldn't believe that it was the same person that was being written about. But I could imagine, if I'd been a bit older, if I'd been in my 30s or 40s, and I heard that a new John Lennon biography was coming out that was very scathing, I probably would buy it, because I'm immediately attracted to things that go against the normie mainstream view of everything. And it's not to say I would have definitely believed it, but I think I would have been curious. But the jury's out really on whether a positive book or a negative book sells more copies. Now, this is back to Barry Miles. The violence of the response indicated he touched a raw nerve in society. This was a subject that interested him greatly, and we talked about it often. The conversation ran along these lines. Ever since the days of early Hollywood, celebrities have fashioned a public image at odds with who they really were. Their task was undertaken by the studio publicity department, which wrote phony biographies. The same happened in the early days of rock and roll. More recently, the stars themselves have become more the author of their own myth. But what makes celebrity biography so difficult, particularly in music and films, is that the myth isn't just the work of a publicity department, nor is it totally the work of the star. What happens is that after his first success, the public responds by projecting an image which then he has to accommodate himself to. Many rock biographies give the impression that the stars invent themselves, but Albert disputed this, and I agree. This is quoting Goldman. It's the public that really reinvents them and makes them what they're going to be forever, and that raises a bigger issue about who really is the star in a phenomenon like rock and roll. My work for over 20 years has proven that the real protagonist in rock and roll is always the public. It's the audience's manias, the audience's images, the audience's cravings, yearnings, delusions that's really decisive. The performers are the puppets of what the public wants. Obviously there's some truth to that. If you take John Lennon and this saintly image, which does still carry on, I mean, every time he has a birthday, you go to social media and someone will say something, oh, John's light is still shining on us, happy 80th birthday, or whatever it is. I think that's going to go on forever. And obviously the Lennon estate, predominantly Yoko and now Sean Lennon, they are continuing this. And again, I hate to rag on Madeleine Boccaro's book because it was a great book, but she's just perpetuating this myth as well. So that myth will continue of that John and Yoko were destined to be together. And regardless of what you think in 1980, the idea is basically presumed that they would have stayed together and that they'd still be together now. And of course, Yoko perpetuates that. I mean, how she could possibly know, however deep their love was, that they would still be together. Let's say if John had stayed alive and was now alive as an 83-year-old man, that they would have stayed together. How she could possibly know that is beyond me. Now, Barry Miles said, it's the importance of popular culture in people's lives that is being threatened when you question the basic tenets of belief, thus the violent response. So it might have seemed a reckless move to take as the subject of his next book, the recently martyred John Lennon. Albert had interviewed John and Yoko for the New York Times shortly after they arrived in the United States and believed all the received wisdom about John. Quote, my interest in Lennon was entirely a product of my admiration for him, and my admiration wasn't confined to his work. It was also his character. He had the bravery to come out and say those things that run against the current of his profession, which is always to talk bullshit and butter people up and smile and fawn and so forth. He didn't do that. He stood up like a man and said, this is bullshit. That was one of the things I most admired, that he was the rare 1 in a million pop star who doesn't give a damn. He just comes up and tells the truth, and if they don't like it, too bad. It's that feeling that he was such a great believer in candour about his own life that was really my mandate, it seemed to me, as a biographer. When you tell the truth about John Lennon, you don't betray John Lennon. Quite the contrary, you fulfil the mandate John Lennon has given you. And I should say that I'm currently devouring the audiobook of Matt Williamson's Tune In. I think it's a standard version. I read the expanded version about 10 years ago, shortly after it came out. I thought I just want to read that once. This audiobook is about 40 hours or something ridiculous like that, but I'm absolutely steaming through it. And Lewison, he will admit, has his own prejudices. He's very much a John guy, certainly in part one, but arguably, they were John's band up to the period that the book covers, which is the end of 1962. Mark does talk about the darker sides, but you can hear from his interviews, although I absolutely love the guy for what he's contributed to Beatles research, he's not going to be too critical. He goes into dark areas, but he doesn't really ever attack John Lennon. And I think Albert Goldman's book was an attack, and to some people that's wrong because a person can't defend themselves. But, I haven't read all the biographies of Beethoven and Mozart and other composers. Apparently there've been a lot. I haven't read any of them. I'm sure there's some dark stuff in that regarding their characters, and they've been gone for a lot longer. Anyway, Barry Miles says, Albert hired a team of researchers, one in Tokyo, one in Liverpool, several in London. And in fact, the number here is 800 interviews over a 6-year period. So it's 600 or 800, that's a lot. Often returning a dozen times or more to check and double check and to get his or her take on newly acquired information. He quickly began to find conflicting stories and encountered the gap between image and reality. Quote, the most shocking thing to me is that Lennon was such a violent person. The Prince of Peace was a man of war. That's very startling. Of course, once you get it into perspective, you see that peace to him was not a political issue. He wasn't talking about peace the way a politician would. He was saying that violence is a terrible thing because I'm a violent man and I regret the violence. He said it over and over again, but nobody listened to him. And that was true. Now, a lot of this might hinge on how literally you take the Rolling Stone interview John Lennon recorded with Yoko on December the 8th, 1970, which went out in early 71, and of course is now known as the Lennon Remembers interview, because there was a book that came out. John did dial back or completely reject some of the stuff he'd said. He sometimes said he was making stuff up. I think he said that to either Hunter Davis or George Martin, or perhaps both, when they challenged him. But again, how do you know? Is John telling the truth when he said he was lying? It's just so difficult to know, because there's so many contradictions. He is, and will always be, unfortunately, an unreliable narrator. Some of that's partly due to drugs, due to other psychological issues that he undoubtedly had. I'd say there's no doubt that he was on the spectrum of 2 or 3 psychological disorders, such as borderline personality or bipolarity, probably OCD as well. This is Goldman again. The other shocking thing is his extreme passivity, the submissiveness. I mean, anybody could get hold of John Lennon and just lead him along like a child into the most bizarre beliefs, into the most destructive practices, into the craziest financial swindles, into all sorts of terrible things. He was so gullible. He was passive. Yoko was dynamic. He came to rely more and more on her energy and her dynamism. Their relationship was, I think, a classic example of mutual dependency. He needed his Aunt Mimi, that mother surrogate who would be very firm and very strong, and who would be very dominating, and who would really provide him on the one hand with the protection he craved, and on the other hand with the direction he craved, and also would relieve him of everything he disliked in terms of nuisance business responsibility. So that's what she provided him with, and it's worth anything to somebody like John Lennon. And he gave her what she'd most craved in the world, which was fame, power, celebrity. She's dedicated her life to self-promotion, and very successfully, because Yoko Ono is universally known. Now, there's so much to unpack. I can't possibly unpack all that. That's just one paragraph. So a lot of marriages, people who are married will say there's codependency, there's a certain convenience to it, it's a long-term partnership. All those things. I think John and Yoko's marriage, from 5.5 years of doing this podcast and all the stuff I'd read before that, it's boringly somewhere in the middle of the myth and this extreme dependency that Goldman's implying. I mean, he's making some very sweeping statements. John Lennon was passive and gullible. The whole magic of John Lennon, if you think about it in terms of him as a figure of interest to me and others, is that he was passive, but he was also dynamic. He was various things, and he changed so much that just to say he was one thing or another, I think is reductive, unfortunately. And maybe he did do 800 interviews, but I would like these people to come forward. But I mean, that's a lot of people, and I've never really heard much. There's quotes in the book, obviously, and I did reread the book a couple of years ago, and some of the writing to do with the psychology of John Lennon was fascinating. For example, when he was talking about in 1965, when he had a bit of a hermit period, one of many, when the Beatles had a bit of a break and he was gobbling LSD and was profoundly depressed, to me. Some of that's great, but there are some real generalizations in what he's talking about. Now, just talking about when the book came out, so this is Barry Miles. When The Lives of John Lennon was published in 1988, Albert went into hiding in Vienna until the expected storm blew over. He'd already received threats, and no one had even seen the book yet. Albert was aware he was yet again exposing a raw nerve by questioning a cherished myth, and was justifiably worried. The moral indignation ran for 4 months, played out across the world's press, and even merited a Newsweek cover story. Rolling Stone, owned by Yoko's best friend Jan Wenner, ran a special Lennon issue which tried unsuccessfully to dig the dirt on Goldman. U2, in the film and album Rattle and Hum, issued a death threat. I don't believe in Goldman, he's typed like a curse. Instant karma's going to get him if I don't get him first. But despite all the noise, as with Elvis, no one sued Albert for libel. Now, I don't know what the legal implications are for suing somebody for libel. Maybe Stephen Cockcroft from Nothing Is Real could tell us about that, because you often get this, someone will bring out a book that's very controversial and say, well, I've never been sued, but I don't know how easy it is to sue people, even if you're Yoko Ono and you've got very powerful lawyers, as we've seen in the last few years. I think Fred Seaman and Peter Doggett and Mike Tree could all attest to the power of Yoko's lawyers, but I'm not sure about that really. In terms of indignation, we are living in this age of mass information, but we've never seen ever, I think, in human history, a time when so many people are choosing outrage over facts. As I said, most people who hate this book probably have not read it. And if they read it, they might find some stuff that justified their beliefs, no doubt. But just the idea that now emotion just trumps everything. Maybe it's always been that way. I don't know. I'll be very interested in people's opinions about this, because I haven't really made my mind up, but I think there's a lot of food for thought. Now, they do make the point here, the biggest problem came from the publisher, who wanted a controversial Albert Goldman book like Elvis. Albert was 81,000 words over length, and his editors cut out great chunks of text, dramatically changing the balance of the book. Albert intended to contrast his serious musical analysis and psychological profiling with Lenny Bruce-style Jewish comic stuff, but the positive, enthusiastic material was cut right down, leaving only the controversial. The final tone of the book was ungenerous, self-righteous and smug. Already 6 months late in delivery, Albert was unable to correct their changes. He was unhappy with the book even before it came out. Really, that puts a whole different spin on the whole thing, if you believe that really it was the publisher who was looking for the dirt. Of course, the obvious question is there any chance that we will ever see these 81,000 words? Tune In had a special edition. I would absolutely love to read a expanded, Lives of John Lennon is already long enough, as is Tune In, but I would love to have this expanded edition with these more positive bits and to see what portrait in the end comes out. Because I think people like Ray Connolly, and I wasn't really a big fan of his book Being John Lennon, I thought it was fairly needless really, wasn't really offering anything new. He did find a nice middle ground in those last 5 years between Coleman and Goldman, what is now accepted. And nothing that the public never seem to grasp is that a lot of things which are, conspiratorial, alternative, away from the normie mainstream version of things, they get accepted, but no one seems to notice. So the next time that something comes along that's outside the norm, it can be dismissed again. It's quite a strange thing, really. Now, Goldman was preparing a book on Jim Morrison, apparently authorised by the surviving Doors. That's quite interesting. And I think Jim Morrison probably would have come out similar to Elvis and John Lennon, depending on what the publisher cut out, because he was clearly a pretty flawed character. Right, the last paragraph. In any event, as Albert said, if the myth is really what the public chose to believe rather than something imposed upon them, if it really comes out of the core of the public's being, you're never going to change it. I don't care how much evidence you present, what witnesses you draw up. I don't care how many times you quote the person themselves. It isn't going to make any difference. The people who call me an iconoclast are very mistaken. I'm not breaking any images. It isn't my intent, but even if it were, I would be sadly incapable of achieving it, because myth isn't something you can argue with. And that's a good place to end that. Please send me your thoughts, glassonionpod@yahoo.com or in the YouTube comments section. And now, finally, 40 minutes in, we're going to get to the main bulk of this episode. So I mentioned the episode was called Revolution 9 Revisited. This is my appearance 3 or 4 months ago on the fabulous Pop Goes the 60s YouTube channel, hosted by the fabulous Matt Williamson, someone who I've got a great deal of time for. He's been on Glass Onion. We did a monster episode of 1968. I've been on his show, I think, 3 or 4 times now. We always have a great time, and we have a nice time when we do prelim chats on Skype or Zoom. And yeah, he's someone I warm to a lot, and hopefully I'll meet him in the future, as I met Ghosty a few months ago. There isn't really too much to say about this, because I think we were both very pleased with this episode. It originally went out on video, and I'll put that in the show notes if you want to see Matt's pretty face and my ugly mug. We make reference back to a previous episode of Glass Onion, so you can check that out. That was an episode I did at the end of the first year of the podcast, and it was an episode I was very pleased with, and that maybe ushered in a new phase of the podcast as well. So without further ado, I'm going to cut to Matt Williamson and myself back in the early part of this year. Episode 101 is in the works. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a guest episode. I've been teeing up a couple of guests, so the podcast will go on, as I said, at the end of episode 100B. There'll be no spoken outro to this episode, just the outro to the Pop Goes the 60s episode. So I'm going to leave you with that now. So see you next time and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. This is Matt Williamson from Pop Goes the 60s, and today we're doing a spotlight on Revolution 9 with my special guest, Antony Rotuno. Welcome back, Antony.
Hello. Yeah, it's been a while. What was the last one we did? You Never Give Me Your Money, I think, wasn't it?
Oh, I was, yeah.
Must
the
be a year
book.
and a bit.
Yeah, the Peter Doggett book. And today we're going to delve into a track that's probably the most, what would you call this song? I mean, it's not a song, I guess. It's a track, but it's probably the most controversial Beatle track probably out there. And we'll go into why that is.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't call it a song. I want to make that point, just that you can't compare it to, I Want to Hold Your Hand or something.
Right.
It's
definitely.
A sound collage or a sound picture, as George Martin called it. So,
and I think it's because of that very reason that people skip it and they do not listen to this track. But we'll talk about that a little bit. But first, let me introduce you to some of the people who may not know you from my past shows that you and I have done together. Antony has his own podcast called Glass Onion on John Lennon. And he does, you've done how many shows now?
99.
99, okay.
Yeah. Making the audience wait for number 100 because I'm waiting for one of my guests to be available. So,
okay.
Yeah, 99 plus bonuses. So probably about 110 shows I've actually put out.
Well, the reason I chose Antony for this discussion in the Spotlight series is because he's already done quite a lot of work on the topic of Revolution 9, not only in his podcast, but he's also done some writing on the topic as well.
Yeah, it was episode 25. It was the end of 2019. It's the end of the first year of the podcast. And I feel like it was a breakthrough episode because up to that point, I'd done some nice episodes, but I recorded that around Christmas. I had a couple of drinks, nothing too outrageous, but just a couple of drinks. And it was the first time I'd really personalized on the show because I'm really obsessed with this piece. Again, I'm not going to call it a song, but we'll call it a piece. And I can explain why if you want later on. That it is to do with the way I heard it and a certain couple of sets of circumstances in which I heard it. But I really love this. I think this is a major piece of work. And I'm glad that you kind of agree with me to some extent, I think.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. So I would go so far as to say that it heightens the Beatles' overall catalog. And then when we're talking about the White Album, it takes the White Album to another stratosphere of a masterpiece because of its inclusion. And it's very much misunderstood, and I completely understand why. It's certainly not for everybody. But I thought it'd be a good idea to give a different perspective on some of the nuances of it that makes it so special, and that it is really quite, this is well thought out, very well thought out.
Yeah, it's a nice mixture of random and thought out, because I'm sure John Lennon didn't look for all these pieces. I guess we've got stuff to say about who actually compiled them and everything, but I don't think he looked for specific ones, but I think he just cobbled together lots and lots of diverse sounds, and obviously they did the voices, but sounds and sound effects. And then he crafted it together. And in a minute, when we talk about our origins, I will explain that, because I've got to give a big shout out to a guy whose website I first read in the late 90s, I think. And he really helped me make sense of that. And that was the first time I realized that this was well thought out. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice mixture of random and structured.
Well, for those people who are not that familiar or who have been able to avoid it this long, I'm just going to give you a brief description here that comes from William Eckert, who wrote a book called The Psychedelic Popular Music, A History Throughout Musical Topic Theory. And he said Revolution 9 is a sound collage which has been described as a piece of experimental, avant-garde, musique concrète, surrealist, and psychedelic music. So that's about as short of a description, I think, as you'll find, but that covers the bases.
Yeah, so avant-garde is to do with, avant-garde literally, it's related to the word vanguard, which is to do with advancing, which actually comes from the army, from the military. So it's to do with, it's the front line in the sense of the one that's advancing first. And it's also used in terms of movements, as in genres. And then, you could say sound collage, musique concrète, as you said. I just find this piece much more interesting than a lot of the ones that inspired it, which again, I guess we'll come to later. But it's, as I said just a minute ago, George Martin called it a sound picture. And he talked about how you could sit in front of the speakers, either with headphones or just with a big pair of speakers, and you could picture what's going on. And you could picture the confusion. And it's the confusion inside John Lennon's head. If you remember, you were on Glass Onion, we did a really nice couple of shows on 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how John Lennon's nervous system just took an absolute hammering that year, partly self-inflicted, partly to do with what was going on. So I think it's about what's going on inside his head, but then it's also Vietnam and the whole chaos that was coming in America. Because when you were on my show as well, we talked about something that I've never heard anyone talk about, which is the fact that Martin Luther King was assassinated while the Beatles were in India. And we never heard nobody asked them what they thought about that, because they would have heard about that when they came back from India, which would have been pretty crazy. You know, they're in this world of meditation and peace. They come back to get that news. And then obviously Robert Kennedy died. So I think it's a picture of John Lennon's internal world and then the external world of 68 as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is your first memory of hearing the song? I just want to get your history, and then I'll give you mine.
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, when I very first heard it, in this magical sort of 2-year period when I had the Beatles full immersion, which was in the late 80s, which was nice because in one sense you had to work a little bit because I had to go to the library and get the cassettes. But on the other hand, I didn't have to wait. You know, it wasn't like in the 60s when you had to wait for them to come with a new album. It was one of the last Beatles albums I heard, and the White Album in general, it did kind of throw me a little bit, and because I was more steeped in the more catchy, easier to listen to stuff, you could say, more accessible. Revolution 9, I didn't really have a strong opinion on it. I thought it was a bit strange. I didn't listen to it a lot, but I do remember playing it to some people at school, and their reaction was actually anger, which is quite an interesting reaction. You get that sometimes when you challenge people too much, or, you know, something that doesn't seem to make any sense. Often people will get angry. But the person I wanted to shout out was a fellow called Ian Hammond, and he had a website back in the old internet days called Beethoven. He's obviously done the same thing as the Beatles and made a little pun. So Beathoven. And he actually listens to Glass Onion because I mentioned him when I did my episode on Revolution 9, and he got in touch, which was great. Yeah, he had a website, and he showed me that, as we said earlier, the structure was there. For example, pointing out that the piano, which he also pointed out was in B minor, which made me think of sadness or melancholy. Mm-hmm. The piano and the number 9, which I'm sure a lot of people always thought was George Martin, because it sounds like it should be George Martin doing that test engineer voice. He said that they come in roughly every minute. So roughly every minute of this piece has got a flavor. And the other thing I noticed through him was that you'll see about 5 minutes in, everything ratchets up and it gets very intense. And then it all comes down again. So I started to think of it in a more symphonic way. You know, you're bringing them up and then taking them down again. Mm-hmm. So that was really my history. And then over the years, I've just become obsessed with it. And I should mention, just to be candid, I did used to enjoy it with herbal jazz cigarettes, as they're called. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I remember lying in the garden with headphones on under the influence, and just suddenly something clicked. And I think the left-right panning is very interesting. If you listen on headphones, you'll hear the sounds drifting. And from then I've become, I don't know, probably quite obsessed with it, because I'm quite obsessed with John Lennon's speaking voice as well as his singing voice. Mm-hmm. And when I think about it, I can hear trauma in his voice. I don't have it here, but I wrote down a load of ways to categorize sound. So he's sort of growling, whimpering. It sounds almost like a baby at one point. And I got this image of Yoko cradling him in a kind of mother type way. Mm-hmm. And the vocalisms are absolutely astonishing when he's sort of going, right, right. I can't do it with my voice, but he makes these incredible sounds. So, in short, I'm quite obsessed with it. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Well, my experience, I first heard it at the age of like 9 or 10. So this is when I was with my friend Dan. He all of a sudden got several albums given to him by his older sister. And the second batch was Revolver and the White Album. So we took to that, the White Album, just like the others. And I did realize there was something different about the album as a whole. It just sounded more mature and there was a more darkness to it. But when we got to side 4, we typically would get through about a minute and a half, 2 minutes of Revolution 9, and then hit the eject button. That's why I know the first 90 seconds much better than the last, 6.5 minutes.
6 minutes, yeah.
We would occasionally listen to it all the way through just because we're doing whatever in the basement. And it didn't seem to bother us. I know people do get angry about this and they don't like to be challenged in that way. And it is a challenging piece. Maybe we're just preoccupied. So anyway, it wasn't until many years later, I was in my mid-20s and I was taking a nap on a Saturday afternoon, which I never do. And my roommate had the White Album on the CD player. And I remember Revolution 9 comes on, and I was just coming out of a dream or out of my sleep. And I'm listening to this track really for the first time because I was too tired to get up and shut it off and hit the eject button.
Nice.
So I'm laying there, and I'm like, wait a minute here. And it spoke to me in a way that I hadn't done before. So it just caught me at the right time. So it was at that point, good, 12, 15 years later, that I began to appreciate it. Now, I still don't listen to it a lot. And the last time I listened to it was just, hours ago before we were going to do this because I wanted to take it in fresh. And to my surprise, I was surprised it was over so quick. Now,
nice.
I was expecting it to go on longer. And I was really listening. I listened more to the instrumentation probably than the vocals, or to the voices. So we'll talk about a little bit about the instrumentation coming up here. But that's my background with the song.
That's interesting that we both heard it in a kind of haze then, really, didn't we?
Yeah.
Because I get that as well. I mean, I used to be a pretty bad insomniac, and so I would be often quite sleep deprived, and then I'd have a 10-minute nap, and it sometimes it's magical, isn't it? You suddenly feel you're in a nice state where your senses are quite heightened, but you're a bit hazy at the same time. And actually, there was another time I have a friend called Ian who was he and I met on the first day of school, and we just clicked instantly. And started talking about old films at the age of 12. He was the only other person I'd ever met who'd watched black and white films ever. And I remember actually he wasn't really a big fan. And I remember I had a car, wasn't a great car, but it had a really good stereo system. One night we sort of parked up, probably again under the influence of the jazz cigarettes, and it was quite dark. And I said to him, right, just try and imagine 1968, John Lennon, traumatic time for him, traumatic time for the world. And I cranked it up really loud. And again, like I said, I think the panning is very important, the stereo setup of it. And I said, right, just for 8 minutes, just be real quiet, shut your eyes, let this thing kind of wash over you. And after 8 minutes, I said, what do you think? And he said, yeah, I get it. That was it. That was his only reaction. I don't love it, but I get it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think the hazy, somehow if you are under the influence or you're a bit tired or something, I don't know, it's because your senses are a bit sharper, and maybe you let your guard down, when you're a bit tired or you've just come out of a nap. So maybe it's not having that resistance to it. If people don't want to listen to it, of course, it's fine. They don't have to. But I just think if you are at all into that kind of experimental stuff, the same way that, I like experimental films as well, then I think there's a lot there. That's why one of the reviews was very ironic, saying this has got no re-listen value, because the whole point is that you can't get it on one listen. So
yeah, I would say it took me years and very few listens, but it just took time. But we will get to that for sure. Let's jump over to the inspirations to this track, because this idea of avant-garde music or musique concrète, these were not new, but they were new to pop music, I would say, by and large. And there were the pieces that came before it that probably inspired John Lennon, perhaps via Yoko Ono and Paul McCartney, and because everybody was starting to dabble in this type of stuff, the Avant-Garde, as you put it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, musique concrète, I've got a couple of, I think I have anyway, definitions. So musique concrète. Now, it might seem strange that it's called concrète, which means concrete, because the whole point is it's very abstract. But what it is, it's using concrete sounds. So the idea of, in Revolution 9, you've got bells, you've got, I don't know, whatever it is, just mundane voices, and then car horns and things like that. So there's a couple of definitions. A type of music composition that utilizes recorded sounds as raw material, or a recorded montage of natural sounds, often electronically modified and presented as a musical composition. So I'll just chuck out a few names. So you've got Schaeffer's Symphony for a Man Alone. And I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll just point out the similarities for each one. It's very brief. Mm-hmm. So you've got human sounds like in this piece, there's a laugh that's looped. So obviously there's laughing in Revolution 9 as well as crying. James Tenney's collage number 1, and note that he's calling it number 1, which may have influenced number 9. I think you haven't heard that, have you? But I'd urge you and the viewers to listen to that. It takes Elvis Presley's Blue Suede Shoes and mixes it with just random sounds. And I've only heard it once, but I'm not sure whether Blue Suede Shoes is actually backwards or it's somehow distorted. But I think it's the idea of taking something very mainstream and recognizable and mixing it with avant-garde. You've got Gesang de Jungling by Stockhausen, and note that Stockhausen was on the Sgt. Pepper cover. Mm-hmm. I think that would have been courtesy of Paul McCartney. Williams Mix by John Cage, Frank Zappa's Return of the Son of Monster Magnet, which is similar in the sense that it's got a beat. And although Revolution 9 doesn't actually have a beat, I came up with an idea the other day of listening to the isolated drums of Revolution 1, the slow version, with Revolution 9. And it's weird to hear it with a beat, because that's obviously where it came from Take 18 of Revolution 1. And then probably the closest one is Rosart Mix by John Cage, which again, it includes baby sounds, which you hear in Revolution 9. And that one is probably the most similar. But what I found really was that none of those were anyway as interesting as Revolution 9. I think Revolution 9 is way more interesting. And again, it's partly because I have this very strong association with John Lennon that goes back to being, 13 years old. Mm-hmm. So I'm connected in that way. But yeah, there's a few pieces. And then a piece that was influenced by Revolution 9 is a track called War Games by the Loving Spoonful. Again, that'd be worth listening to, mm-hmm. which is similarities. So yeah, it's got a bit of musique concrète and avant-garde in a very general sense, yeah.
Did you mention Stockhausen's Hymnen?
Oh, no, I didn't actually, no. That's actually got a radio scan, isn't it? Which influenced I Am the Walrus.
Very true.
Would you say that was the closest one?
I would say, yeah. And I think a lot of this experimentation that became what was called avant-garde came out of the classical.
Yes.
And that because classical was really advancing in the first half of the 20th century, getting into very strange territory. And I think that's where John Cage came from. That was his background initially, I believe. Yeah. But you can see that all these different things that were going on at the time influenced Lennon. In fact, the one that was called Number One, I'll have to look that one up because that is interesting.
Collage Number One, yeah.
And I would assume that with the influence of Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono over the course of the 2 years leading up to this, it has a lot. I mean, their fingerprints are all over this.
Absolutely, yeah. Can I ask you a question? Listening to these musique concrète, how would you do you find any connection between them? Because I find use of voices and things like laughing put backwards and radio scans. Is that what you think of as musique concrète? Everyday sounds, is it?
Yeah, usually everyday sounds, and usually that the composers would modulate it or change something to make it seem brand new. Like you were saying, it's reversed, or there's some kind of electronic flourish put on it to make it sound different. I actually, believe it or not, I actually had a part in creating some musique concrète in the medical field, if you can believe it. I just happen to think of it now. I worked for GE for a while, and I was in the marketing end of things, and I got brought into a project where one of these big MRI machines, I believe it was an MRI, there's this machine that is incredibly loud. And when the body is inside this long tube and their body's being scanned, there's this loud sound that is very scary. So they were trying to figure out how to make it not scary. So I suggested creating was really a musique concrète intro that would essentially alert them that sound was coming so they would be ready for it. So in that case, we were using, I was trying not to use music, but using everyday sounds that were somewhat familiar to them, and I put it to somewhat of a beat so that they could not be scared by it. And this was patented. I don't know that anything ever came from it. I left GE, and who knows?
You're not getting royalty checks?
Not yet. I'm not. But it's not like that's going to be, who knows? I mean, I don't know. That probably never went anywhere. It's just one of the many projects that GE works on that just goes nowhere. But like any project, really. Although Revolution 9 didn't go nowhere, it did certainly go somewhere. And the beginnings of it, like you had mentioned earlier, it was born out of the fade out of Revolution 1, which when I heard that, I'm like, wow, that was really surprising.
That was such a big find, wasn't it? When that appeared online about 15 years ago, whenever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was incredible. And that's where these vocalisms that I said that I can't do myself. With John Lennon, amazing. This is screaming and whimpering and all the things he's doing, on this track. But yeah, of course, then you hear, then it's Revolution 9 with a beat, with that shuffle beat that comes from Revolution 1. Yeah, it's so interesting. When I think of avant-garde, I'm going to quote George Martin again. George Martin said, Paul McCartney is very avant-garde, but apart from private sort of experiments, films that he made in his spare time, he mixed it with the commercial. And
correct.
If you think of it in terms of film, are you familiar with Un Chien Andalou by Buñuel? Or you're aware of Buñuel? Buñuel was a Spanish surrealist filmmaker, and he did a short film called Chien Andalou, which means an Andalusian dog. And there's a famous scene where a razor cuts somebody's eyeball.
Yes, I do.
You've probably seen that.
Yes, I have seen that.
You've seen that image. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about that, and I just rewatched that a few months ago, actually. It was part of an English class, funnily enough. It's basically a load of scenes, and all the scenes are recognizable. The human behavior in it is recognizable, but there's no real narrative. So avant-garde is a bit like taking a lot of noises that we recognize, even could be musical, but then not giving you an easy through line, not giving you a narrative. So you have to work on it yourself. Now, if you compare that to something like, are you aware of the Warhol films? One called Sleep, which is literally just a guy sleeping, or Empire State, which is just shot at the Empire State Building. For me, I almost draw the line. I don't really see too much value in just watching a guy sleeping for 5 hours, unless, I don't know, you mix it with something really interesting so you get a juxtaposition. I think there's got to be a little kind of hook. And I think Revolution 9, if you compare it to some of these other musique concrète, it's actually got more quote-unquote hooks, just because obviously John was a pop rock musician. So the more you listen to it, the more you realise that there are things which, not necessarily commercial, but they are things you can hook on to at least.
Yeah, some of the instrumentation that was used in the track are familiar. I mean, we heard Mellotron. It's almost like some of the incidental Mellotron we hear in Magical Mystery Tour.
Yes.
They actually use some of the same loops that they used on Tomorrow Never Knows. There's some piano. There's familiar instrumentation. It's just very sparse. It's not the main thing. And that's what makes it so on pop. For McCartney to release something, it would have had a pop structure to begin with probably the musique concrète added on top of it rather than the other way around. And that's just one way that the two minds, Lennon and McCartney, how different they were and how they approached these things.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the difference. So by 68, I think John Lennon, although he definitely liked the White Album because the songs, I think his songs on it are just fabulous. You know, there's 5 or 6 songs that were born out of India and this massive withdrawal that he was going through. I think when you came on did the 68 show, we said they probably had a little bit of Cynthia Lennon wrote they had a little bit of a hooch, you know, a bit of alcoholic punch and probably a few joints, but he was essentially withdrawing. Mm-hmm. So he was still into pop rock music, but I think he was going through a stage where he wanted to say, if I do something avant-garde, I'm not going to put it in a pop framework. I'm just going to give them it and hope that they enjoy it as much as I do. Because on that Revolution 1, take 18, you sort of hear John at the end going, oh, it's great, you know, and him and Yoko are laughing about it, how they're really pleased with themselves, you know.
Yeah, he was having a good old time. And I think should be noted that Yoko Ono was brought into the fold and they began a relationship only a couple of weeks before they started on this track. I think it's about 2.5 weeks, maybe 3, but relatively it was recent. And I think that part of this is the giddiness over the relationship with her. And I think he was really trying to impress her. Paul McCartney was offering this kind of stuff 2 years earlier, and he wasn't quite taking to it in the same way. And this shows, that's why I say he was trying to impress her. I think that's why he got really into it. And the other 3 members, essentially, at some point, they each were in America during the recording of this. So they removed themselves from it, probably because, you know, they just were the third wheel, 3 third wheels.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, George Harrison's such a strange guy, isn't he? The more I read about him, he's very like John Lennon in that there are just a massive contradictions. And you're never quite sure whether George Harrison was into something or he wasn't. You know, he seemed to switch a bit back and forth and was a bit reticent about getting too excited about anything other than, you know, Indian music and, you know, the Hindu philosophy and things. So he contributed to this, but not totally sure. I mean, you had a quote that you sent me where they were all embarrassed when John played it. Is that right? Including George?
Yeah, let me just talk about how George helped to compile it. There's a quote that I was very surprised to read where George said this. He said, Ringo and I compiled that. We went into the tape library and looked through the entire room and pulled main selections and gave the tapes to John, and he cut them together. The whole thing, number nine, is because I pulled the box number 9. John sat there and decided which bits to crossfade together. But if Ringo and I hadn't gone there in the first place, he wouldn't have had anything. So I think that's overstating it a bit, because Chris Thomas, who was producing it eventually, said, hey, he recalled going down and getting tapes, sound effects with John. So it wasn't just George and Ringo. But I found it was very fascinating that they had that much input to the selection of the tapes that were used.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not totally convinced that it necessarily matters which sound effects they use, to be perfectly honest. He says, you know, without that, John wouldn't have had anything. I think John would have been well capable of going to the library and the EMI library and finding them. It's not really so much the sounds. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's the way they're put together and the spooky atmosphere that is created. And like I say, you know, if anyone is interested in pursuing this track a bit more, I definitely recommend headphones. I definitely think it's more effective late at night or early in the morning, you know, when your senses are in a certain place. I think it's so. If you take some of the very mundane, I mean, there's a sound of it sounds like drag car racing. There's a guy saying number 30. There's an announcement. There's obviously the American football fans going, block that kick. Mm-hmm. And there's a loop. Have you heard the loop of George Martin saying, Jeff, turn the red light on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's weird. Jeff, turn the red light on. And it kind of drifts left and right. So I don't think it's really the sounds, although it's interesting to hear laughing, crying. It's interesting to hear that. And then there's a bell at one point. It's pretty mundane, really. I don't mean mundane as a bad thing, but mundane in terms of everyday things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I say the only things that are really strange sounds is these John vocalisms, as I said. And when I did the show, I actually isolated them. And to hear them all together is quite something. So I don't think it matters so much what the sounds are. So I wouldn't necessarily give George. I give him credit for compiling it, fair enough, or getting them together. But I think John was the one. I think it was the only time they ever utilised 3 studios at the same time. I'm sure that's the only time. And when I did my show, and like I said, I wrote something about it as a sort of an extension of the show, because I was supposed to be writing a book last year that may still happen, may not. I always think of this kind of mad pop star, rock star, commandeering all 3 studios. And, you know, he was the one who was taking the sounds and putting the fader up and down and so forth.
The mad scientist.
The mad scientist, exactly. It's even more if you think that they used to wear white coats, didn't they, the engineers at Abbey Road?
Yes, they did.
Which just seems more and more appropriate, you know. I think I wrote something about, you know, when they were considering taking Lennon off to the funny farm once and for all, you know, because it must have been an incredible night. I think it was 8 a.m. till 2 in the morning or something. But I think it was really John, and I guess with either direct support or moral support of Yoko, who kind of mixed it, if you like. Yeah. But obviously George did the voices.
He did. And George also, the reason why I found another thing about George Harrison, that he maybe had a better understanding of what was needed when he did pick out those tapes. Because if you listen to the Wonderwall album, there's a song called Dream Scene. And that is very much like the predecessor to this track. It's got some musique concrète in it, and it's got sound effects. That is really quite a predecessor to Revolution 9. And that was recorded, would have been either November 67 through February 68. So he came to those sessions, I think, with a little more background I think most of us have ever given credit for. But, you know, again, I think he kind of removed himself from it once John and Yoko kind of, you know, let it run away with themselves.
Yeah, there's a couple of quotes, aren't there? Do we know whether these are verified, that John Lennon said Avant-Garde was French for bullshit? And
that's George, one of the famous, yeah.
Yeah, maybe true, maybe not. And George Harrison said, I haven't got a clue.
Yeah, that one I believe he may have even said, he might have said that in the anthology as well. So,
did he?
But I think those are both accurate. And, you know how Lennon is, one of his flippant remarks. But I think obviously he was thinking of it differently some years later.
You know, he wrote 2 books, obviously, in his own right, spanning in the works. There's a posthumous one called Skywriting by Word of Mouth. And some of it is actually fairly straight narrative of him talking about that period, because they were going to do a musical called The Ballad of John and Yoko at one point. John and Yoko, not the Beatles. And he seemed to turn. He's one of these people who would believe in something for a long time. And then when his expectations or fantasies weren't realised, he'd turn on it. I have a bit of a psychology background. This is a fairly classic character trait of certain people. They get very into something, and then when it doesn't turn out to be what they want, they abandon it very quickly, and they make snide remarks about it in the future. So he turned on Janoff, he turned on Rubin and Hoffman. I don't know, maybe he turned on the Avant-Garde as well, because the point has been made that he was very unexperimental, really, in his solo career. After Plastic Ono Band, arguably sometime New York City is quite experimental in this idea of rock journalism, but he really became a fairly straight musician from Mind Games onwards, really. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very so true. I think he turned on it like he turned on a lot of things.
Yeah, very fickle.
Oh, of course. I mean, that is John Lennon, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But do we know anything about John and George doing these voices? Do we know where they came from? Because I never found, were they reading from magazines or something? I don't know anything about that.
I always thought that they were just spontaneous and they just picked a couple of words that they liked and just added it to the mix. So I didn't think there was anything really thought through on that I can recall. Yoko's maybe, on the other hand, some of that was already recorded and they just used those pieces and put those in, which are very interesting.
Is that from this audio diary? No, this audio thing she was doing while they were recording. She sounds like a little girl the whole time, doesn't she? Very childlike. It's quite adorable in a way. She sounds very naive, although I don't think she was a very naive person generally. I think her and John, they're probably a weird mixture of quite childlike and naive, but quite streetwise at the same time. That must have been, it's one of the reasons they connected, I'm sure.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think they complemented each other too, because John, his pop background was just unmistakable, and he always returned to it, and it was just part of him. And then obviously Yoko introduced him this whole other side that he just reveled in, at least briefly, for a few years. But like everything else, he kind of moves on or reverts back to Bebop-A-Lula.
Well, he'd always love that, wouldn't he? If he'd lived to now, if he was 83, whatever he'd be now, he'd still love Bebop-A-Lula, yeah. He'd be into something and then he'd turn on it for a while and then he might have gone back to it, we never know. But it's interesting that, like I said, if you are into this track, let's call it, this piece, some of the actual vocal stuff that him and George do, the talking, it does become quite iconic in the way that if you think of I Am the Walrus, those King Lear lines, serviceable villain and sit you down, father, rest you, they become iconic. They might be the only Shakespeare lines that some people know if they're not into Shakespeare. But, there's bits like the Watusi, the twist, El Dorado. George says, El Dorado.
El Dorado.
And John says, take this, brother, may it serve you well, which is I use at the end of Glass Onion episodes as the music's faded out, which is just fantastic. And he uses a Scouse accent. So you go like, so the wife called, and we better go to see a surgeon. It's that exaggerated Scouse that you hear on Polythene Pam, So to me, because I've heard it so much, those lines have become iconic. And there's actually different mixes of Revolution 9. There's a mono mix on YouTube. It's not that different, but it's just a little bit different. And then someone has actually done a deconstructing with isolated tracks, which all sound fairly similar, but one track will have maybe more voices and one will have, certain instrumental bits louder. So there are a few variations. I'd like to know, where John and George were getting that from. I feel like they might have been reading it from somewhere. There's stuff like financial imbalance, and another famous line is every one of them knew that as time went by, they get a little bit older and a little bit slower, which is fair enough. Can't argue with that.
Yeah, and I can't help but wonder that if Paul McCartney was actually around, what his contributions would have been. Because I think that... did Lennon take the opportunity to do that while he was gone? Was it just a way for him to get it out of his system? Because Paul McCartney, I think, probably felt a little put out that he, either one, wasn't really included in it, or two, feeling, you're doing this now after I introduced you to this a couple of years ago. Yeah. And it was really Paul that set up his studio so he could mess around with tape loops. So for Lennon not to include him, it just kind of shows, I don't think he was keeping him out so much as he was just so enamored with his relationship with Yoko Ono. And like I said, that kind of ran off with itself. And then Paul McCartney comes back to find, basically, he felt like Cynthia when she found Lennon and Ono in her bathrobe. I feel like McCartney was the same. It was the same thing with him, They invented the studio instead of the bedroom.
These are the conversations we're never going to hear, aren't they? I think, did you send me something where, he played it to the other members of the group when it was finished and their faces fell or something?
Yeah, this is from the Jeff Emmerich book, Here, There, and Everywhere. Let me just read that quote. So as I mentioned, McCartney had been in America for a while during the recording of that, and then George and Ringo also for a period. So when they came back, this is in Jeff Emmerich's book, a few days later, all four Beatles were united in the studio, and John proudly played the 2 tracks that he had completed while the rest were away. I could see from the dark cloud that came over Paul's face that he was totally underwhelmed with Revolution 9 when he first heard it, and there was an awkward silence after the track faded out. John looked at Paul expectantly, but Paul's only comment was, "Not bad," which I knew was a diplomatic way of saying he didn't like it. Ringo and George Harrison had nothing to say about the track. They looked distinctly embarrassed, and you could tell that neither of them wanted to get caught in the middle of this. This scenario here is not like what happened a year later with Maxwell Silver Hammer. So you get the two extremes McCartney on one extreme, it's almost like he was getting them back, But I mean, poor Ringo and George had to, they just got to put up with it, So this is a Paul and John thing. And yeah, I mean, it's too bad that I think Paul could have added something to this, but maybe it was better this way. I don't know. I don't like to see them fight. So that's the bias I bring. I would have liked to have them be all harmonious, but it just wasn't that way.
Yeah, I think we have to accept that there are certain conversations we're never going to know about, either because people don't remember or they don't want to reveal it. But yeah when we did that 1968 show, we talked about the one and only 24-hour Beatles session. And it was 5 in the afternoon on one day to 5 in the afternoon the next day, which weirdly enough was about 2 days before John and Yoko were busted at Montague Square, which is quite weird. You just think of John Lennon, that's a weird 3 days for John Lennon. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're never going to hear that conversation of, when they were sequencing it, because that was what most of that session was. Shall we include it? Shall we not? Did they fight? Did Paul say, yeah, all right? Yeah.
Well, I think somebody it may have been Emmerich again, that there was a big argument regarding putting it in or leaving it out. And ultimately, we know it went in. And I think that the album is better for it. I mean, there's very few things that can compare to it in pop music. So I think that was the right decision. I mean, yeah, if they didn't put Revolution 9 in, the 2 tracks that would have taken its place would have been Not Guilty, but that George Harrison song, and then What's the New Mary Jane, apparently. Yeah. But those tracks don't really add to the overall White Album landscape like Revolution 9 does. So I think the compromise that was made, no matter how it got to be, was probably the right one.
I mean, I could see a case for saying that fans were deprived of 8 minutes of classic Beatles, more mainstream music, let's say. I quite like Not Guilty, actually. I'm not mad at What's the New Mary Jane. But if we think about side 4, the last side of the White Album, I've always found that very spooky and this is from 14 years old, because it was always, White Album was always the headphones album for some reason. Maybe I realised not only Revolution 9, but the whole album. Maybe I just realised it was better. I remember it as being a kind of a late night headphones album for me. And but side 4 has a weird spookiness. I've always loved, that Can You Take Me Back? Can you take me back where I came from? The whole Paul's voice on that is very strange. And Cry Baby Cry sounds weirdly spooky, although it probably wouldn't. That's got that childlike quality, because that sounds a bit like a nursery rhyme. That's quite interesting. And then, of course, a great bit of sequencing, really, to have Revolution 9 and then have Good Night and have Ringo, who's always going to be the most accessible Beatle, the most everyman Beatle, singing you to sleep. Because if you think of Revolution 9 as a nightmare, then a lullaby fits well. Yeah, it's almost like someone waking up from a nightmare and they want to get back to sleep, and Ringo sings them back to sleep. Quite a nice image, really.
And done in the most over-the-top schmaltzy way you could do it, which really is what makes the song. I mean, I don't care for that song on its own, but in its place on the White Album, it really works well in a way that I never would have thought it could.
Yeah, but did you hear that version of it on the White Album box set?
Oh, I love
with
that.
The voices.
The backing vocals, yeah.
Lovely.
I kind of wish that would have maybe got a separate release. Really nice.
That was lovely, wasn't it? But yeah, it just lends a spooky air to it. And I suppose as well, it's exposing avant-garde, musique concrète, that kind of music to people, because I think everyone would have listened to it once. Maybe there's some people who decided after 2 minutes they hated it and literally have never listened to it. But I think everyone who bought the White Album probably would have listened to it once. Yeah. I've described it in the piece I wrote as the only Beatles song with 0 party value, in the sense that in those days, music was mostly to dance to and to listen to together. Obviously, people would be listening on their own, but I think that sort of headphones culture of Sony Walkmans, that's when I was a kid, Sony Walkmans and iPods and stuff. People listen much more with headphones and, as they're going off to sleep, that's a whole different thing from in the 60s, where generally it'd be people sitting around in a room, either their bedroom or a party, listening to things together. So you can't even imagine, how would that work, being at a party, playing the White Album, and you got Revolution 1, Honey Pie, Savoy Truffle on side 4. And then suddenly you got this.
You have a good point. I'm sure it got played at parties and it just was there, and people just had to what,
I know.
I'm sure it happened.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to bring, John Lennon has a couple quotes of what the song meant. And let me just give a couple here, because he talked about he was trying to paint a picture of a revolution using sound. And he said, Revolution 9 was an unconscious picture of what I actually think will happen when it happens, just like a drawing of a revolution. All the thing was made with loops. I had about 30 loops going, fed them into one basic track. I was getting classical tapes, going upstairs and chopping them up, making it backwards and things like that, just to get the sound effects. And he says it's not specifically about anything. It's all a set of sounds. Like walking down the street is a set of sounds, capturing a moment in time. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's about, like I said, just to kind of reiterate, his internal trauma that he was going through, plus Vietnam, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, all the race riots that were happening. I can hear all of that, because it's interesting that you can hear, there's a sound halfway through it that sounds like a kind of sizzling or burning sound. And I often think of it as burning rice paddies, because I used to live in Southeast Asia. I lived in Thailand for a while and also Laos, and they're both near Vietnam. And I studied about the Vietnam War a lot. When I did sociology at college, I did a whole thing about the counterculture in Vietnam. So I can hear all that. And you can hear, when John Lennon's screaming, for example, he's partly screaming for himself, but I think, they could be the screams of war. You hear gunfire, you hear all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what it really is to me. Having listened to it, God, you'll think I'm a total lunatic if I tell you how many times I've listened to this. It's got to be 30 or probably 50, to be honest.
Wow.
But over, not like in a row. It's over decades. But
yeah. Well, one of the things that I wanted to mention, and kind of plays off what you just said, with the critic Robert Christgau and John Piccarella called it an anti-masterpiece, and commented that in effect, for 8 minutes of an album officially titled The Beatles, there were no Beatles. I thought that was a great quote. It's almost like the revolution comes and, it's kind of apocalyptic. And the fact that there's no Beatles music there underlines that apocalypse. It's like, wow.
Yeah. You've got little bits of Beatles. It's really the John George and Yoko show, I suppose, isn't it? But I like anti-masterpiece. That's great. Yeah. Because I honestly think this is a masterpiece. I mean, I think but like I said, because I've connected with it somehow and I've listened to it that many times that I do hear new stuff every time. Could I talk about some of the forerunners to it in terms of Beatles songs?
Yeah, why don't you?
That'd be all right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just buzz through these. There's about 6 or 7. I'll just mention them briefly. So if you go back to 66, you've got Rain and I'm Only Sleeping has got the backwards, obviously the vocals, backwards guitar. And then if you think of Yellow Submarine, they've got all those voices in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Now those voices, they're a little bit musique concrète because it's just sounds of people talking. But they married it to the music. And then again, it's this idea of having something that's commercial and then adding tape loops to it, as we said with the Paul McCartney thing. Obviously, Tomorrow Never Knows, and George Martin called Revolution 9 an extension of Tomorrow Never Knows. Strawberry Fields Forever fades out, and then it comes back in with that little bit at the end, that kind of coda, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Strawberry Fields Forever is weirdly disturbing as well. I think John called it psychoanalysis set to music. And again, you can hear that's kind of about his childhood traumas as well. That Strawberry Fields was a place where he used to play as a kid, but it also had a nightmarish quality because his childhood, in a way, was a nightmare, the traumas of it and so forth. And then you've got even just stuff like Getting Better, on Sgt. Pepper, they use the strings of the piano. They pluck the strings instead of playing the keys. Mm-hmm. And then Good Morning is a good example because the animal sounds at the end of it, the idea is that each animal was capable of devouring the one that came before. So you've got two things going on. You've got random sounds of animals, which is an everyday sound, depending where you live, depending which animals are in your everyday life. Those are everyday sounds, but there's some thought done. And I think that was John's idea. So rather like Revolution 9, there is thought behind all this stuff. And then obviously being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, now we can hear that isolated tape of all the cut-up bits that contributed to the steam organ. If you play them on their own, they don't mean anything. But then you've got that sort of tooty organ, that melody being played on an organ at the same time as them. So you've got a bit of juxtaposition, but it makes sense because you've got a framework of something recognizable. And then the last one's just I'm the Walrus having the radio scan. A radio is an everyday sound as well. Mm-hmm. So no, they had form and they were just gradually building up to this. And then John said, let's go no holds barred. Let's give them nothing particularly commercial. Although I argue, like I said, there are hooks in it. But certainly on first listening, there's nothing to hook onto, because I've noticed with these musique concrète, you get sounds that seem to be going somewhere and then disappear. So you get little snatches of often backwards piano, backwards whatever it is, but then they just sort of disappear, they drift off. And again, Revolution 9 uses a stereo very well because it lets you, things pan from left to right and then disappear and then reappear and start on the right and go to the left. It's very weird. It's quite disorientating and it's quite spooky. I think spooky is a word I always come back to with this.
Yeah. Have you listened to it in 5.1 surround?
No, I haven't. No, Alan Kozin talks about that, doesn't he? I nearly had Alan Kozin on Glass Onion. I said we could do the interview in 5.1 if you want. He thought that was quite funny.
I've not heard it that way. No, I've not. In fact, I actually bought a surround system, a secondhand one, about 5 years ago with the intent to listen to these box sets in 5.1, and I've not set it up yet. So I'm getting around to it.
I think Revolution 9 would be one of the perfect ones.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
I wonder how that would come across.
Yeah, we had some very positive reviews of the song, but we also have some negative ones. So the Jonathan Gould quote that you mentioned earlier, he calls Revolution 9 as an embarrassment and stands like a black hole at the end of the White Album, sucking up whatever energy and interest remain in the preceding 90 minutes of music. It is a track that neither invites nor rewards close attention. I think a lot of fans feel that way about that song, actually. So I think that as a critic, though, I thought he was listening to it as an AM radio listener that expected, a Beatles song and didn't step outside of pop music to evaluate it. Because to call it, it may suck out the energy. He may get that right. But that it neither invites nor rewards close attention, I think, is a miss.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite an ironic statement, really, because I think the only way that you would like it is after repeated listenings. Is he the guy who wrote Can't Buy Me Love? I think he wrote Can't Buy Me Love, the Beatles, Britain and America.
Oh, did he?
I added him on Facebook. I might unfriend him now after that. But joke. No, I think he wrote that book. That's a fantastic Beatles biography, Can't Buy Me Love. But I just found that, a little bit ironic because it definitely invites and rewards close attention. Yeah,
and Ian MacDonald had something interesting to say about it as well. He was comparing this song to Luigi Nono's similar Non Kusami Amo Marx from 1969. And he said that Nono's piece, he said, to see how much more aesthetically and politically acute Lennon was than most of the vaunted avant-garde composers at the time, Nono's piece entirely lacks the pop-bred sense of texture and proportion manifested in Revolution 9. So that goes back to what you were saying earlier about the Beatles and Lennon in particular. Their foundation is on pop. So that's why he was able to, I think, put this together in the way he did. And then MacDonald recognizes how much more accessible it is within the whole avant-garde oeuvre, I guess, of Interpop, and was some kind of reflection on what was going on, that Lennon could recognize it easier. And I would go so much farther to say that only Lennon could recognize that far more than Ono, because of what Lennon had seen of the world in his travels with the Beatles. He was looking at the world in a much different perspective, and a broader perspective, just because of his Beatle years, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I love Ian MacDonald. I love Revolution in the Head. I don't know if I said this earlier, but I was saying those forerunners that we talked about, the Cage and that, I just don't find them very interesting. I mean, I can't remember which show it was we were doing. We were talking about John and Yoko's, they did a film called Smile, which is obviously John's face going from a non-smile to a smile, slowed down, so it takes however long. I think we said on the show that we were really happy that those ideas were out there in the world, but I don't necessarily want to watch the film.
Yeah,
sometimes you get that,
That's kind of the problem with some of, I think, what more the Fluxus movement, which was, I think people confuse it with Avant-Garde. It's kind of almost a humorous way to go about some of these happenings that you had to be there, and they were of their time. And since that time has passed, they're just kind of like, hey, man, that's been done before. I mean, they're not impressive today. And that's why I wouldn't watch them. They're just of their time. They've not weathered the time well.
So what about, can I ask you, do you like surrealist films in general, avant-garde films, maybe with a mainstream framework? Are you quite into those?
I wouldn't say I'm quite into them, but I've always appreciated. I mean, the earliest thing I got into, I guess, was the Alfred Hitchcock Spellbound with the Salvador Dali dream sequence. That was 1945. That stuff started rearing its head, more so in the 50s. But yeah, I've always been into that. But I don't think I would like to see a straight surreal film. Like you said, I like pieces of it dropped in. So it's maybe the more McCartney approach to it than having so much surrealism that I couldn't really grasp it. That's why it took me so long to grasp Revolution 9. It took me another 12, 15 years before it really said something to me, and another 12, 15 years before I really could say, hey, this is an important piece of work, and here's why. It just takes me longer to assess it, and I need time to pass to assess it, because I have to assess it to other things going on in the contemporary time that it was made.
Yeah,
that's why the Dali dream sequence in Hitchcock's film is so revolutionary, because it was an early piece entering the mainstream.
Yeah, within a mainstream film. Yeah, I think I'm more on the McCartney side as well. I was brought up on 80s pop music originally. Then I got into the Beatles in the late 80s, and everything else went out the window for a few years. And then I was into 90s, Britpop and grunge and stuff. So I don't really like commercial stuff. But with films, I think I was exposed to quite abstract films from an early age. But I would like to ask, if John Lennon was alive, and he appeared on Glass Onion, which I'm sure he would have done. I would like to ask him, did you ever sit through Smile? Or he did a film called Self-Portrait. I don't know if you know that. We'll let the listeners look that one up. Shall I tell you what Self-Portrait was? Do you know
go ahead. Don't keep us in suspense.
his member going from flaccid to erect over a period of about 45 minutes. Yeah. I would ask John and Yoko, have you sat through those films? I know you think they're great ideas, and maybe they are great ideas in their heads, but like I say, maybe it's the ideas more than the actual enjoyment of them. If I could just mention a couple of films which are among my favourites, and this might seem a weird comparison, but if you take Apocalypse Now, which is one of my favourite films, that is a Vietnam film. That's got elements of, say, Platoon, the Oliver Stone Platoon, and other ones, Full Metal Jacket. But it's also got this very hallucinogenic, chaotic thing, which obviously came from the making of it. And Coppola, when he was at Cannes, famously said, my movie isn't about Vietnam, my movie is Vietnam, which, sounds a bit big-headed, but the idea was, because the making of it was such a nightmare, he just turned it into this completely surreal. So he's showing you the surreal side of war rather than necessarily a more straight thing, which Platoon was. Yeah. And then the other film is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which, again, I've heard people talk about that and they get angry because there's no dialogue for 45 minutes. You've got long stretches of nothing happening. And it makes people mad. But when you're into it for whatever reason, and Kubrick's my favorite director, once you connect with it, suddenly all those negatives become positives. And you think, well, it's so nice to have this weird, spacey film that doesn't have any dialogue for long stretches and has all this strange music. It's nice when you've connected with it. So I think that's really what you come down to. But a lot of this musique concrète, I find it very difficult to connect to because they're not really giving you anything at all to hook onto.
Well, I think the visual always helps. Sometimes that helps bring the sounds along. It gives the sounds more groundedness, I think. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's some of the music concrete that I've heard, I just cannot get into it. I mean, I can appreciate it for what they were trying to do, something different and outside of the mainstream to challenge people. I think that's the point of a lot of it, is to challenge people. I'm not up for the challenge of all this stuff. I mean, I'm a busy guy. I got a lot going on. I mean, do I want to take the time to really go through all this? And in the case of the White Album, it's just something thrown in the middle of an album. So it's probably as digestible as it's going to get. And yeah, I mean, I think most of us listened to it accidentally. We didn't choose to listen to that. We just, what is this, you know?
Yeah, it was put there, wasn't it? You know, right at the end as well, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to tell your viewers, yeah, try that experiment. And to you, play on YouTube, you can find the isolated drums of Revolution 1, obviously the Ringo track. Play it very, very quietly in the background of Revolution 9, and suddenly you kind of hear it suddenly has a beat. I mean, it already has a kind of a pulse, because there's a kind of bass hum that sort of goes. There's some bass notes, and they use that very effectively. So that there are little hooks that you can go on to, and obviously the backwards sounds are just incredible. You know, there's a heavenly choir, if you remember. There's a very intense part, and then everything goes quiet. You hear this heavenly choir backwards, which is very, very disturbing. I don't know. I've always liked religious music. I think wasn't on air, but we've talked about this, haven't we? I actually did my first ever gigs were actually in church. So I've always liked the echoey ambience of a church. And that heavenly choir really is quite strange, and all the backwards sounds. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. There's so much there. That's why Jonathan Gould, although I love his book, that's a very ironic comment. Couldn't agree with that, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Well, the Beatles have one other avant-garde piece in the vaults, and that's Carnival of Light, which was not really a produced piece, but really was, I guess what you'd say, a live performance, a spontaneous live performance, which would not have the nuances of Revolution 9. And I don't know that we're ever going to hear that. I got a feeling it may leak out at some point. We'll see what happens. It's probably going to be very underwhelming, because it's the guys they just made it up on the spot just to. In those days, you could get away with that, you know, for happenings. But my guess is it's not going to be very rewarding after we listen to it. But I'd like to listen to it.
Yeah, unfortunately, if you build things up, the chance to be disappointed with them is greater, unfortunately. But True. I heard Mark Lewison talking about it. He's the only person I've ever heard talk about it. I don't know how many people have heard it, apart from people at the time. He likened it to, you know, the 27-minute version of Helter Skelter that we haven't heard, which unfortunately is a 27-minute version of the slower Helter Skelter that we heard on the anthology rather than the finished one. You know, I'll be happy to hear Carnival of Light. I think it'll come out before Paul passes on. I think he'll find a way of getting it out there. I mean, he could do it anytime, really. I don't think anyone's stopping him.
Well, I think there is somebody stopping him, actually.
Oh, is there?
Well, it was supposed to be in the track listing for Anthology 2, and it actually made the physical track listing. It was recorded at the last moment. It was a George Harrison thing.
No, I'm saying now, though.
Pardon?
I'm saying now, though.
Oh,
now,
well,
because George isn't
I
here,
think
but...
I think that the reason it hasn't come out is because perhaps, and this is a guess, that Olivia is standing by George's not wanting it out back in 1995, because the perfect place to put it out would have been on the Sgt. Pepper box set, and it didn't get on there. So that told me something, and I was disappointed, even though it's probably going to be something like Revolution 9, where 99% of us are going to listen to it more than once. But I think it's a Beatle track, and it's of the time, and that would have been the place for it. And it's a shame that it didn't make it out.
You were talking earlier about visuals. I don't think it's on YouTube anymore, but someone made a video to accompany Revolution 9. I'm not sure if it's still online. Yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it was an interesting video, and it was just, this is a long time ago I watched it, but it was just a series of fairly random images. But I think if you could find good images and marry it to the music somehow, I mean, if I had the skills, I'd probably try it myself, but I don't have any of those filmic skills. I think you could really heighten it quite a bit.
Well, I'm thinking back to that time I was napping on the couch and I woke up to the sounds of Revolution 9, and that was the first time it really hit me. I didn't need a visual. I guess my head was creating them. I think that's what makes the track good, is that it conjures up some automatic visuals, and some of these other Musique concrete songs do not. And that's why I'm not that interested in them. So that's kind of how I differentiate, I guess, what is meaningful to me, the visuals they create without having the physical visual in front of you.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I'm just thinking of the sort of video they made for Day in the Life. Don't know if they made that at the time. That was the session for the orchestral overdubs. But they had some quite random. There was like I remember an image of a clock at one point. Just stuff like that. I'd like to see someone try it. I'm not saying it needs an official release. But I think maybe a filmmaker who's got a surrealistic edge, likes all the abstract and really likes Revolution 9, I think they could do something with that. But yeah, I agree. You can get the visuals yourself. But as you said earlier, sometimes the visuals do help you along, in the right hands.
Correct, yeah.
There you go, some homework for you. You've got the editing skills that I haven't got. So.
I put on a very long list of projects for the channel here.
God, tell me about it.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's a good place to probably end the conversation here. And I hope, hopefully we'll inspire some people to give the track another listen or two, or at least just approach it with a little bit of a different perspective. And for those of you who want a little bit more information on Revolution 9, Antony's done a full podcast on it, episode 25 on Glass Onion, podcast on John Lennon. I'll put the links below. And I'm sure, Antony, we will have you back for some more spotlight pieces here. But this was very, very good, very satisfying to delve into this particular track.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I do like talking about it. And hopefully some of my enthusiasm for it will have rubbed off on the viewers, because it's definitely worth a listen. There's so much there. And I think, it wouldn't spoil the surprise for people to try to seek out what those sounds are. Some of them are very recognizable: laughing, crying, car horns, etc. But some of them have been identified. And again, I credit Alan Cozen. He was on another Beatles podcast many years ago, talking about some of the sounds. You've got a piece by Ralph Vaughan Williams, who's an English composer. You've got some Schumann. You've got Sibelius, who was Brian Epstein's favorite composer. And there's a few isolated tracks here and there. So yeah, there really is plenty there.
So, Antony, tell me some of the things you've got going in addition to the Glass Onion.
Yeah, so we've got Glass Onion on John Lennon, is available everywhere. I've also got Life and Life Only, which is more psychology and alternative media, and Film Gold, which is obviously about films. You've been on, we did Rear Window. So I sort of lean towards older films. Haven't done any abstract avant-garde films yet, but you never know. If I could quote John Lennon, which unfortunately came from the very last day of his life, the famous interview with RKO, he said, I always consider my work to be one piece. And my 3 podcasts definitely do overlap. So John Lennon gets mentioned on the other ones, and vice versa. And I've got a website, Antony Rotuno, Antony without an H, rotuno.com. It's also got my music and my blog. Thanks very much. Always nice to come on here.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.